Air Canada had a customer support chatbot driven by an LLM that made up a bereavement discount, right?
Welcome to the Gen AI Security Project Threat Intelligence Podcast Series, Episode 6.
This allowed this chatbot to make irreversible changes based completely on a prompt.
Where expert hosts Rachel James and Dr. Bryan Nakayama, co-leads from the Gen AI Security Project Threat Intelligence Initiative, share the latest and greatest on AI threat intelligence. The opinions expressed in this podcast are theirs and theirs alone and do not reflect the opinions of the organizations through which they are employed. So let's start with a couple of definitions before we launch into today's podcast. Zero day, I want you to speak on and define, and then threat actors. We've thrown this term, bandied this term about. Maybe, Bryan, I could get you to describe a little bit of threat actors, because it feels like it's a different way of saying criminal. Is that intense, or what is it?
I think something, threat actor, and Rachel, I'll let you address kind of zero day. But threat actor is a term that's definitely, you'll probably ask 10 different CTI analysts, and they'll kind of give you 10 slightly different answers. But, typically when we refer to threat actors, we basically mean the hacking groups behind a specific attack, right? With what degree of precision you're defining those, with what degree of connection between, let's say, individuals who compose a threat actor group, those are, kind of down to the nitty gritty preferences of the researcher, right, themselves. But so threat actor, basically, when you hear that, just think hacking group. That's the easiest way to do it.
Hacking group. Okay. All right. Thanks. And what about zero day, Rachel? Maybe you could give us a little definition on that.
Yeah, I think part of, let me just speak a little bit to a really interesting question that you brought up when you said, well, is threat actor just really mean criminal? I think the reason we don't use the phrase criminal in place of threat actor is, in cyber threat intelligence, we do distinguish the difference between financially motivated threat actors who are doing more criminal activity that you would consider maybe fraud, and maybe blackmailing people, from threat actors that might be motivated by nation state goals, like geopolitical goals and things like that. So the reason the threat actor term is used for hacking groups as sort of a catch-all is there is these sort of different flavors of these threat actor groups that are motivated by different things, and not all of them are sort of maybe purely criminal and for profit. When it comes to the term zero day is an old term that refers to vulnerabilities that have just been disclosed. Zero day implies that there is a working exploitation for a vulnerability that does not have a patch, right? So if you have a Windows system, you have maybe an application that has a vulnerability, and the threat actor groups are able to find that vulnerability and figure out how to exploit it before the company that owns that product is able to find the vulnerability themselves and deliver a fix for people to apply to that. That's one of the most dangerous circumstances that an organization can operate in, because that means there's now a way for threat actors to successfully attack and hack that system without any way of you being able to fix it. 0 days are significant because in the threat actor world, for an organization, that's obviously very dangerous, right? There's no way that you can sort of prevent them from getting in and attacking the system other than totally taking the system offline, right? And in some cases, if we're talking about maybe a 0 day that's in a Windows operating system, that could mean the only way that you can successfully prevent people from attacking you is to take down every Windows machine that you have. And that's usually not something an organization can do and continue to operate and make money. For threat actor groups, 0 days are kind of the holy grail of when they're doing exploitation, discovery, and research, because this means that they can attack companies who don't even realize that they have this vulnerability and get in before they're able to fix it. And so when we look at cyber threat forums and we look at the threat actor community, I think something that's really significant about that is the fact that those 0 days in those instances are the going on the market for tens of thousands to even $1 million. So if a threat actor group is able to discover a 0 day, it's very significant risk for organizations, and it's a significant boon for threat actor groups themselves.
So on radio, we call this a segue. We're going to speak specifically to a particular organization that is one of the largest to ever exist, and it's Meta, right? The parent company of Facebook and Instagram. There's an AI prompt injection, had an account takeover this month. Bryan, can you talk about the vulnerability in Meta AI's support and assistant and what happened there? And this to me is kind of scary from somebody who's building up a business, because I think, well, holy cow, if Meta can't protect, what chance do I have to protect against this? And maybe you could talk specifically about this attack, Bryan, and then maybe Rachel could expand on how this could relate to a smaller business or medium-sized startups moving forward.
Yeah, so this is a kind of classic example of giving, kind of an AI chatbot excessive agency, right? The ability to do things beyond the scope of what it should be able to do. Although I think, probably Meta would say that, it is doing what it should be able to do, right? It's just that maybe it shouldn't. But in any case, so basically what happened was that attackers were able to take over accounts using Meta's AI support assistant in Instagram by basically using, the forgotten password flow, right? They're basically, initiate a password reset via an AI chatbot. And then they just tell the chatbot, hey, look, I got a new email. Could you change the account's email owner to this? And then the, AI chatbot will then send a verification code to the attacker controlled email address. The attacker gives the chatbot the code, therefore they're authenticated, and they're then given full account access, right? And so this kind of demonstrates one of those kinds of difficulties of using a chatbot for something sensitive like account support like this, right? Where basically, again, actors were able to exploit that in order to take out the attack. And, so notably Meta, in talking about this incident, was like, oh, there was no breach of our systems, right?
Which is crazy, right? Like, if anybody else had been able to use this workflow outside of AI to get access to a system, we would have absolutely would have called that a breach, right?
So was it an incident, or is it a structural problem? Like, is it something that's fundamental to Meta's systems, or is it, just a one-off kind of a thing?
That's a great question. I think the root cause right here is it is actually architectural. Like, this is very, very similar to when we were talking about the banker bot situation with Grok, right? So in both cases, these chatbots had the ability to do these actions. In this case, Meta, they were able to have write access to the password reset, and there was no really like hard deterministic authentication that you would expect from a normal workflow to reset passwords. So, this allowed this chatbot to make irreversible changes based completely on a prompt. And so, Meta's statement that there was no breach of our systems is so insane to me, because if this was a normal, not AI driven system, and I was able to, without being authenticated, reset somebody else's password, we absolutely would be framing it that way. So this really highlights the difference between sort of traditional security classifications of incidents like this, and the difference between those and when AI enabled account takeovers happen, right? Because as Bryan said, according to Meta, this actually isn't a breach because it's working sort of as expected. So when you are an organization, just like we were talking about, if you're an organization that is considering letting AI do certain financial transactions, you really should be thinking about how it is going to react to different prompts and the maybe full scale of what it's authenticated to do, right? The BankerBot instance was a transfer of like $140,000 of value from one wallet. And in this case, if you're a business and you're thinking, gosh, password resets, users that get locked out of their accounts, this is really help desk sort of low level functionality. It might even be high volume for your company, and it might be a really attractive workflow to want to automate with AI. We see a lot of initial AI adoption in businesses being this sort of help desk type functionality. But similarly, you have to really think about the level of agency that you're giving this system and whether and how you're going to build some more hard deterministic workflows in it, like authenticating that the request to reset somebody's password is actually coming from the user whose password you are resetting. So this is just one of those sort of fundamental examples of the way AI security and AI cybersecurity defenses are really fundamentally different than traditional systems that we've been thinking about, and some real critical thinking that business owners and decision makers should be thinking about before deciding, well, it's basic help desk functionality. This is a great opportunity for us to reduce human effort, but there's real potential consequences to doing that.
It's interesting because you said that your suggestion is for businesses that are ramping up their AI use to think about all the different possibilities. And it seems to me, by its very nature, it's impossible to think of all the different possibilities. So common sense would dictate as a business owner that you pump the proverbial brakes and maybe really implement some common sense and say, I can't afford to lose $1,000 or $10,000 or $140,000. So I'm going to remove agency from AI, the autonomous agency from my AI chatbot, and return it to a staff member, return it to, or build a check and a balance in there, checks and balances in there, so that an individual human being is looking at it. So it's this is actually something that's come out of, this is our 6th episode. And something that's come out of this podcast is, I believe we're hitting on something that is common sense. We're saying all of these things you're saying to people. It's like the technology is moving so quickly. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. The technology is moving so quickly that it's virtually going to be impossible to come up with all the possible solutions. So maybe don't, because you can't possibly think of all the solutions, maybe don't expose your organization fully through AI at this moment, through chatbots and those kind of things, and maybe pull back and restrain. Would that be a fair assessment?
Oh, I love how you said the word restrain. That's a perfect way of putting it. So when you look at like the OWASP top 10, you look at some of the recommendations we make, you'll see a lot of they're sort of cybersecurity jargon words for us, right? So we'll say things like, you should implement this with the least necessary, or maybe the least privilege, right? And this is a really interesting trade-off between security and business, right? One of the reasons a lot of people are wanting to implement AI, and especially chatbots, for these types of activities is it's supposed to mimic sort of human creativity. They want the ability to use the way generative AI, large language models sort of are creatively able to adapt to a lot of different requests. The problem when you do that is the more you're harnessing like the creativity and the ability for the model to dynamically adjust, the harder it is for you to implement these restrictions. It's harder for you to do what's least necessary, to give it least privilege. So there's got to be a compromise that gets that's striked there. So in the in the case of financial transactions, we mentioned in a previous episode, maybe for transactions that are $20 or less, you say that's okay for the AI to do, because even in the worst case scenario, I'm okay with us losing $20 on a fraudulent prompt or something. But maybe for higher level transactions, it needs a human in the loop, right? You could have the same thing for chatbots. Maybe there's some low-level help desk activities that you are willing to allow an AI system to do. But when we talk about like sort of the common sense thing that you talk about, or you brought up, Dave, we're really advocating for people to we call it in cybersecurity threat model. We say, we use this term like threat modeling your application, but really maybe the most common language that we could use to describe that is think about what the worst case scenario could be. Make sure you're designing your system with the idea the worst case scenario could be possible, right? Bryan, I don't know, do you have any thoughts here about sort of that balance to be struck between the business wants to harness that creativity and its ability, these models' ability to kind of do whatever we ask of them, but we also, on a cybersecurity side, are trying to restrict things to keep people safe?
I think you covered most of the ground, but I do want to go back to, something I said during the Banker Bot episode, right? Which is just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And you're not special, right? And I say that you're not special thing because this has been like a known issue with using, like AI powered, kind of like assistant chatbots for a long time, right? Like one of the, let's say, kind of earliest examples of a kind of malfunction was Air Canada had a customer support chatbot driven by an LLM that made up like a bereavement discount, right? And they ended up going to court over it and lost because that kind of, LLM chatbot was seen as basically being an agent of the company. And so, I think the thing is, going back to imagining the worst possible scenario, don't just assume you'll avoid it because you're built different, right? To go something a little famous on the internet, but the point being is that, again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But I think, kind of Rachel kind of covered it in more like granular level fairly well.
So using AI to find zero-day vulnerabilities has been a really hot topic since Anthropic released their Mythos model. And a big question is whether threat actors are going to be able to do the same. And a new Google report shed some light on how threat actors may be using AI for this very purpose. You want to expand, Bryan?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Dave. So very thankfully, Google releases these periodic reports, which are basically trying to track how threat actors are using AI to enhance their activities and operations. And so, surprise, surprise, right around the same time that Anthropic released their Mythos model and started talking about, in a limited preview, of course, and started talking about how AI could be used to drive the discovery of vulnerabilities, potentially, driving an explosion of zero-day vulnerabilities. Google has this new report out on just that, right? That a threat actor was observed using likely AI in order to discover and then exploit a zero-day vulnerability. And so the reason why we use kind of language like likely is, there's a problem that we'll keep mentioning right throughout this podcast of observability, right? Which is to say, it's really hard to see how threat actors or hacking groups are using AI for their activities. And that's just because you can't see what they're like putting into the prompt, right? How they're chatting with Gemini or Claude or things like that. And so what's really interesting here is, how do researchers figure out that something could have been created by AI, right? And that's because AI, has these kind of very predictable patterns in what it puts into code. So the code that they were using to exploit the vulnerability had these kinds of telltale clues, right? And so these are things like using a lot of emojis, having really explanatory comments that are, that a hacker typically wouldn't put in there, right? Really basic things. A hallucinated CVSS score, which is basically a score that measures the severity of a vulnerability. And so Google basically discovered this campaign before the actor was able to conduct it, where they're basically targeting an open source web administration platform using a script generated by AI to exploit a zero-day vulnerability likely discovered through AI. So thankfully, Google was able to discover this before it happened and disrupting, what they believe to be potentially a mass exploitation event, right? And so it kind of goes to show that here we have this question of oh no, are vulnerabilities suddenly going to be automated? Are we going to just see something radically new and different because of Mythos? And, threat actors are already out there using commercially available models in order to do the very thing that we've been fearing, right? Which is to find and exploit vulnerabilities. And so, kind of stepping back here in terms of thinking about this broader context is, if you look at, for example, Verizon has this, big report called the DBIR, Data Breach Incident Report, which is kind of considered to be the gold standard in terms of trying to look at statistics of what's happening out there in the cybersecurity landscape. And one of the things that they noted for the first time in 19 years, that vulnerability exploitation became the leading initial access vector, right? So it went from 20% to 31% of kind of attacks they see are happening through vulnerabilities, whereas credential abuse, and this is basically where you write down your work email and password, right, in like a sticky note on your computer. I mean, like a virtual sticky note, or like a little note or a Word doc on your computer, and you leave it there, and then a hacker gets on your home computer, steals that, and then logs into your job, right? That's the kind of classical way that a lot of these breaches happen. And we've seen this switch increasingly to use of vulnerabilities. And so what this is interesting is suggesting is that, the threat isn't theoretical. The threat isn't here, or is already here, right? But that being said, I want to be very clear. The sky isn't falling because the sky hasn't fallen, right?
Right.
And, but it goes to show that, actors are likely, in the first instance, Google directly observing an actor, likely, using AI to discover and exploit a zero-day vulnerability. And then you see this broader trend of zero-day vulnerabilities becoming one of the major ways in which threat actors are breaking into systems. And it's suggested that a major influence on that, right, is not just, vulnerability discovery, but the ability to weaponize exploits, right? It just becomes much easier to exploit that vulnerability because software vulnerability isn't just always necessarily easy to exploit, right? You need to have some skill. You need to understand how the software works a little bit. You have to have some, kind of intuition about it. And so that's where, one way in which AI is potentially kind of uplifting actors is by making it easier for them to exploit the zero-day vulnerability.
I've seen the report you sent over. John Hultquist called it a tip of the iceberg and a taste of what's to come. I guess that makes sense, but there's also, well, obviously it makes sense, but there's obviously the opposite of threat actors, people like yourself and like Rachel and everybody at OWASP working to counteract that. And it's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic, and that's why this podcast is so much fun to do. Thank you so much, Bryan. This has been episode 6. Rachel, thank you. Thanks for listening to the Threat Intelligence Podcast hosted by Rachel James and Dr. Bryan Nakayama from the Gen AI Security Project. This podcast is produced by the Gen AI Security Project with help from RumRunner Media.